Late afternoon light stretched across an empty stretch of highway somewhere in the American Southwest, the kind of road where you can see for miles in both directions, and the only sound is the hum of tires against warm asphalt. A black SUV moved steadily down the center lane, not too fast, not too slow, just a man behind the wheel with nowhere urgent to be. Steven Seagal had spent decades in the spotlight. Action movies, martial arts demonstrations, police ride-alongs, television specials. His face had been on magazine covers and movie posters around the world, but on this particular afternoon, you never would have guessed it. No entourage, no bodyguards, no flashy car with tinted windows and spinning rims. Just a quiet man in simple clothes, driving alone, enjoying the silence. Then the lights appeared in his rearview mirror, red and blue, pulsing steadily, cutting through the golden afternoon air. Stephen felt no panic. He simply checked his mirrors, eased off the gas, and guided the SUV smoothly onto the shoulder. He turned off the engine, tucked the keys on the dashboard, rolled down his window, and placed both hands flat on top of the steering wheel. Right, where any officer could see them clearly. That was the right thing to do. That was what he had always taught others to do. He waited. Two officers stepped out of the patrol car behind him. Even from a distance, through the rearview mirror, something felt wrong. Their body language was sharp, aggressive, the kind of energy that didn't belong to a routine stop. The first officer moved toward the driver's side with his hand already resting near his belt. The second went around the back of the SUV, flashlight cutting through the rear windows like he was already searching for something to find. Stephen kept his hands visible and stayed still. The first officer leaned into the open window, eyes scanning the interior fast, jaw tight. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. Just a demand delivered like a punishment. Stephen responded politely. He reached slowly into the glove compartment, explained every movement before making it, and handed over his documents without a word of complaint. The officer snatched them and walked back toward the patrol car without saying anything else. The second officer kept circling, shining his flashlight through the windows, peering in, looking for something that wasn't there. Stephen sat calmly. He had done nothing wrong, he knew it, and he knew that knowing it wasn't always enough. The officer returned a few minutes later and leaned into the window again. His expression had changed. Harder now, like he had decided something. Step out of the vehicle. Stephen looked at him calmly. Could you tell me the reason for the stop, officer? That question alone seemed to flip a switch. I said, step out. Don't make me repeat myself. Stephen opened the door slowly, both hands visible, movements deliberate and controlled. He stepped onto the gravel shoulder and stood upright, facing the officer with an expression that was completely neutral. Not challenging, not fearful, just present. The second officer walked around the front of the SUV and stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, watching with a look that wasn't professional. It was something else, something personal. Look at this guy, he said quietly to his partner, though not quietly enough. Thinks he's real important, huh? Stephen said nothing. The first officer stepped closer than necessary, close enough that Stephen could see the tension in his jaw. You got a reason to be this calm? I haven't done anything wrong, Stephen replied simply. That calmness did something strange to the energy around them. It didn't soothe the officers. It irritated them, like they had expected something different, like they were waiting for him to flinch, to argue, to give them something they could use. And he just wasn't giving it to them. Turn around, hands behind your back. Stephen blinked. For what reason, sir? The officer's voice climbed. I said, turn. Around. Passing cars began to slow. Drivers glanced over. A woman in a minivan tapped the shoulder of her passenger and pointed. Something wasn't right, and people could sense it even at highway speed. One young man parked his car about 50 yards ahead, pulled out his phone, and started recording. Stephen turned slowly. He could feel the second officer positioning himself. Close on his left side. Too close. The kind of closeness designed to make someone feel trapped. The first officer grabbed his wrist, not to secure it, but to twist it. A small motion, barely visible from the road, but deliberately painful. A test. A message. Stephen breathed through it. He had trained for decades to manage pain, to keep his mind clear when his body was under pressure. He didn't pull away. He didn't react. The second officer spoke again, louder now, apparently performing for an invisible audience. You keep looking. Around like somebody's gonna save you. I'm looking around because I'm allowed to, Stephen replied evenly. The officer stepped into his line of sight, blocking his view. Don't get smart. Stephen met his eyes. I'm not being smart. I'm being calm. We're going to search the vehicle, the first officer announced. Do you have a reason to search it? We have enough of a reason. Step aside. Stephen stepped aside. The search was not professional. It was theater. Doors thrown open. Seat cushions yanked. The trunk popped and rifled through. Items moved and dropped and left where they fell. The kind of search that isn't looking for evidence, but for a reaction. Stephen stood on the shoulder and watched without expression. A small crowd was forming on the opposite side of the road now. 3 cars had parked. People stood outside there. Vehicles in the afternoon sun, watching. A teenager held her phone up, streaming live. An older man in a trucker hat shook his head slowly. They found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. The first officer walked back toward Stephen, visibly frustrated. He stood too close again. You think this is funny? I don't think any of this is funny, Stephen said quietly. You're just standing there like nothing's happening. Something is happening, Stephen replied. I'm just choosing how to respond to it. The officer's eyes narrowed. Let me tell you something. Around here, we don't like that attitude. Stephen looked at him directly. With respect, sir, staying calm isn't an attitude. It's a choice. That was the moment the first officer lost it. He took a half step forward, and without any warning, without any justification, without any threat to respond to, he swung. It was not the kind of punch you see in movies. It was sloppy, fueled by frustration and ego and the shock of being challenged by someone who refused to crumble. It came fast, aimed at Stephen's chest, slightly upward, and it never landed. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Stephen's left arm came up in a smooth, practiced arc, not a wild swing, not a dramatic block. Just a clean, efficient redirection. The officer's arm was guided away from its target, his own momentum carrying him slightly off balance. Stephen stepped to the side, creating distance, and stopped. That was it. No counterattack, no follow-through, no strike. The crowd erupted. Someone shouted from across the road. He just swung at him. Did you see that? The second officer lunged forward, grabbing at Stephen's shoulder, trying to push him against the SUV. Stephen twisted his body, broke the grip using the simplest possible motion, and stepped back again, hands open, palms out. I am not fighting you, he said firmly. I defended myself. There's a difference. The first officer, off balance and embarrassed, screamed into his radio. Suspect is resisting. I need backup immediately. From 50 yards away, the teenager streaming live gasped. He didn't resist anything. He's just standing there. Are you kidding me right now? The second officer froze when he saw the cameras. Not just one camera. 6, 7, a dozen phones pointed at the scene from every direction. People were standing on the hoods of their cars to get a better angle. Something changed in his face at that moment. You could see it. The calculation, the realization. This was being recorded from multiple angles, and the footage would tell a story he could not control. Steven stood in the center of it all, breathing steadily, hands visible, eyes forward. I want everyone here to hear me clearly, he said loudly enough for the crowd to catch it. I have not resisted. I have complied with every lawful instruction. I was struck without justification, and I defended myself using the minimum response necessary. Silence from the officers. One woman in the crowd started clapping, just once, then stopped herself. This wasn't the moment for applause. It was the moment for something more serious. Sirens rose in the distance, getting closer fast. The two officers stood where they were, the first one pale, the second avoiding every camera. Neither spoke. Neither moved towards Steven. The space between them and him felt wide now, even though only a few feet separated them physically. Something had shifted that couldn't be shifted back. Steven did not approach them. He stayed where he was, hands at his sides, posture still, watching the road as 3 additional patrol cars pulled onto the shoulder in quick succession. A senior officer stepped out of the lead vehicle, older, silver at his temples, the kind of face that had seen a lot of nights like this one. He scanned the scene the way experienced people scan things, not for drama, but for facts. A crowd on one side, 2 officers on another. One civilian standing alone, composed, hands visible, not running, not threatening, not doing anything except waiting. The senior officer walked directly towards Steven. Sir, are you injured? No, Steven replied. Can you tell me what happened? Steven told him, clearly, without exaggeration, without anger. The stop with no explanation. The search with no justification. The wrist grab, the swing, the block, the step back. The crowd backed him up instantly, loudly, from across the road. He didn't do a thing. The officer swung first. We all have it on video, multiple people shouting the same thing at the same time. The senior officer turned toward the 2 officers. His expression didn't shift into anger. It shifted into something quieter, more serious. Ramirez. Step over here. The first officer walked over slowly. Where is your body camera footage? The officer said something too quietly to hear. The senior officer turned back to Steven. Sir, I need to ask you to remain here for a few minutes while I review this situation. Of course, Steven said. That was when the plainclothes car arrived. Dark sedan, no markings. The man who stepped out wore a jacket and carried a notepad. He did not introduce himself to the officers. He introduced himself to Steven. Internal affairs, he said simply. Do you mind if I take your statement? Not at all, Steven replied. The crowd responded to that arrival. The way crowds respond when they sense something serious is happening. Phones went higher, voices dropped lower, people leaned in. The internal affairs officer asked his questions carefully and wrote down every answer. He asked about the initial stop, about what was said, about the physical contact, about the swing and the block, about what Steven did next and why. Steven answered each question in the same even tone he'd used all evening. No performance, no anger, just facts. The investigator looked up from his notepad. Were you aware of the cameras when you responded? To the officer's strike? Steven thought for a moment. I was aware that what I did had to be something I could defend in daylight, he said. Cameras or no cameras? That answer seemed to stay with the investigator for a second before he wrote it down. Behind them, the senior officer had separated Ramirez from his partner. They stood at opposite ends of the parked patrol cars, neither looking at the other. Both of them quiet, in the way people get quiet when they understand that whatever happens next is out of their hands. The senior officer returned to Steven. I want to be transparent with you. The body cameras on both officers were activated, but one has a gap in the footage from the time of the initial contact until after the incident. Steven nodded slowly. Does that surprise you? The senior officer looked at him. No, he said, honestly. It doesn't. Someone in the crowd called out, too far to see clearly, but close enough to hear. What happens to them? The senior officer addressed the crowd calmly. That is being determined right now through proper process. The teenager who had been streaming live lowered her phone for a moment and looked at Steven directly. She was maybe 16, nervous, still processing what she had watched happen in real time. Are you okay? She called out. Steven looked over at her and nodded once. Thank you for asking. That small exchange moved through the crowd quietly. No headlines in it, no drama. Just a man who had just been assaulted by a uniformed officer, turning around and responding with simple human warmth to a teenager who was worried about him. The senior officer stepped close and spoke quietly. Mr. Seagal, both officers are being placed on administrative leave effective immediately pending full investigation. You will be contacted within 24 hours about next steps. Is there anything you need before we let you go? Steven looked at him. One thing, the officer waited. Make sure the people who stopped to film this are thanked, not pressured, Steven said. They didn't have to stop. They did. That matters. The officer nodded. Understood. As Steven walked back toward his SUV, the crowd that had gathered didn't cheer. They didn't rush him for photos or shout questions. They just watched, respectfully, like they understood they had seen something that deserved quiet for a moment. He opened the driver's door, then paused and turned back to face the road. The officers, the cameras, the sun that was now touching the horizon and turning the whole sky the color of copper. He spoke once more, not for headlines, not for followers, just out loud to anyone who was still listening. Power only stays honest when someone is watching, he said. That's not a criticism, that's just the truth. So keep watching. He got in, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway. By the time he was out of sight, the first clips were already spreading. By the time he reached the next town, they were everywhere. By morning, every screen in the country had seen some version of that moment. The swing that never landed, the block that was barely a block, the step back, the open hands. But what people kept coming back to, what kept getting clipped and shared and replayed, wasn't the physical part at all. It was the stillness. A man who could have escalated. A man who had the training, the experience, and honestly the reputation to respond with force. And he chose not to. Every single time he had the chance to make it worse, he made it quieter instead. People watched that and felt something they had a hard time naming, something between relief and respect. like they had forgotten that strength could look like that, like they needed a reminder that keeping yourself controlled in a moment of injustice is not weakness. It is one of the hardest things a person can do. The internal affairs investigation concluded within 3 weeks. The findings were released publicly, an unusual decision pushed for by the department's oversight board under pressure from community, groups, and legal observers. The report confirmed that the traffic stop lacked sufficient justification, that the search was conducted improperly, that physical contact was initiated by the officer without cause, and that the officer's strike constituted use of force outside of authorized procedure. Officer Ramirez and his partner were formally dismissed from the department. Civil proceedings were announced shortly after. Steven gave one interview after it was all over. Short, quiet, no studio lighting, just a chair and a camera. The interviewer asked him if he felt like he had won. He shook his head. Winning isn't the right word for this, he said. Nobody wins when something like this happens. What you hope for is that something changes because of it. Did you think something would change? He paused for a long time. I thought about that on the drive home that night, he said, and I decided to hope. Because the alternative is to stop caring, and I'm not ready to do that. He smiled slightly, and neither apparently was anyone else on that highway. The interview ended there. Simple, quiet, no dramatic music. No slow motion replay. Just a man who had been tested in a very public and very real way, who had chosen every single time to respond with dignity instead of rage, sitting in a chair and saying he still believed things could get better. Millions of people watched it, and for at least a little while they believed it too.